We continue now at the top of Daf Mem Aleph Amud Beis in Meseches Kiddushin. This is Kiddushin Daf 41b. On the previous Amud, the Gemara brought a Mishnah in Meseches Trumos. The Mishnah says, let's say a Baal Abayis appoints a Shliach to take off Truma for him, and the Shliach doesn't know exactly how much to take off, so he should take off the amount the average person would take off, which is 1/50th. And the Mishnah continues, Piches Asar, let's say he does it less, meaning the denominator is 10 less, he takes off 1/40th. A Hosef Asar, let's say the denominator is 10 more, meaning he does 1/60th. In all cases, Truma so Truma. Nevertheless, the Truma that the Shliach took off is considered to be Truma. And the Gemara asks on that, Minolan, from where do we know the concept of Shlichus when it comes to Truma? Meaning we have a source for Shlichus when it comes to Gerushin, and also when it comes to Kiddushin, we compare Kiddushin to Gerushin from the Pasuk. But how do we know the concept of Shlichus? By Truma. And the Gemara says, and if you will say the Yolif mi Gerushin, that we can learn from Gerushin. If there's a concept of Shlichus by Gerushin, there should be a concept of Shlichus by Truma as well, but not necessarily Mala Gerushin. In what way is Gerushin unique? Shekein Yeshnan Chol, because when it comes to Gerushin, that's something that is Chol, that's something that is mundane. It doesn't have Kedusha like Truma. And so the Gemara says, Amar Kra, the source for Truma that you have Shlichus is because the Pasuk says, Atem Gam Atem. It says in the Pasuk, Gam Atem, and we understand when it says also you, that comes to include something. L'Rabos es HaShliach, that comes to include the concept of Shlichus when it comes to Truma. And Rashi says, Minolan the Shliach Torah, from where do we know that a Shliach takes off Truma? Gam Atem, the Pasuk says, Kain Torimu Gam Atem, V'hai Gam Yeseruhu, the word Gam is extra, and that comes to include a Shliach. And the Gemara says, V'nichtov Rachmana b'Truma v'neisu hanach v'nigmaru minei. But if that's the case, why not only write the concept of Shlichus by Truma, and then we can learn from there to other cases? And to that the Gemara says, Misham de'ikol mifrach, because if you're going to try to learn from Truma to other cases, there's also a refutation to that. Shekein yeshna b'machshava, because when it comes to Truma, a person can even take off Truma mentally, even with the mind, without doing any physical action, and therefore maybe you would have said only there's Shlichus. You can't learn out necessarily to other cases. Rashi says, b'machshava nosein einov b'tzadzeh v'ochel b'tzadzeh. The person can look at one side of the grain and say that's the Truma, and then eat from the other side. Techsiv v'nechshav. That's learned out because it's written in the Pasuk, it says v'nechshav. And so again, that's why you can't learn out from Truma to other cases. And the Gemara continues, but what about that which we learned in the Mishnah? Chabura sha'avad pischo. Let's say you have a group. When it came to the Karban Pesach, each group would register on its particular Karban Pesach. Let's say you have a group and they lost their Karban Pesach. They lost the animal. V'yamru le'echad, and they said to one of the to one individual, say, Uvike shushchot aleinu, go find it and shecht it for us. V'halachu matzav v'shachat, and that's what he did. He went and he found and he shechted the animal on their behalf. And in the meantime, v'hein lachu v'shachtu, and they also went ahead and they purchased their own animals and they shechted. And so how do we decide which animal is actually the Karban Pesach? And the Mishnah says, Im shalo nishchat rishon, if his was the one that was shechted first, hu ochel mishalo, v'heim ochlim v'shosem imo, he eats from the one that he shechted, and they eat and drink together with him, meaning to say that shlichus was effective, and that becomes the Karban Pesach, because that's the one that was shechted for. So again, the Gemara asks, Minolan, from where do we know the concept of shlichus when it comes to the Karban Pesach? V'chitema de yolif mehanach, and if you'll say you learn it out from the cases that we had earlier, malahanach shekain yesh. But in those cases, even Truma is considered to be mundane in regards to Karbanos, which has a certain level of holiness higher even than Truma. That's Kachim. The case of Karban Pesach would be in the category of Kachim again, and relative to Karban Pesach, Truma would be considered Chol, and therefore you can't learn out one to the other. So again, the question is, how do we know the concept of Shlichus when it comes to Karban Pesach? And the Gemara says, Nafkolei mid Rav Yoshua ben Karcha. The answer is that we learn out the concept of Shlichus by Karban Pesach from what Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha said. The Yom Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha, because Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha said, Minayin sheshlucho shaladam kamoso. From where do we know the concept that if a person appoints a shliach, the shliach has the same status as the person himself? Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, v'shachatu oso kol kahal adas Yisrael bein harbayim. Again, it's talking about the Karban Pesach, and it says the entire Klal Yisrael, they shechted bein harbayim, they shecht it in the afternoon. That's talking about an Erev Pesach. V'chi kol hakol kulan shochten. Now, does the entire congregation actually do the shchita? V'alo eino shochet ela echad. It's only one person who does the shchita. Ela mikan. Rather, from here we learn sheshlucho shel adam kemo. So the concept of shlichus, that when a person appoints a shliach, that shliach is like the person himself. And so here you have a source for Kodshim, here you have a source for Karban Pesach, the concept of Shlichus. And the Gemara says, Nichtov Rachmana B'Kodshim, V'nesi Hanach V'nigmru Minei. But again, why don't we just write it? The Torah should just write it by Kodshim, and we can learn the other cases from Kodshim. And again, the Gemara says, Mishum De'ikol HaMifrach, because you can refute it. If you would try to learn from Kodshim, you would have a refutation. Mal Kodshim Shekein Rov Masein Al Yedei Shliach. What's unique by Kodshim is most of what is done when it comes to Karbanos is through a Shliach, because the Kohanim, they do a lot of the avoda. They're essentially shluchim, and therefore you can't learn out Kodshim to other cases. And the Gemara says chada mechada lo asya, so you can't learn one to one. Let's say you can't learn from the case of the Karban Pesach to Gerushin, or you can't learn from Gerushin to Truma, etc. But teisi chada mitarti. But why can't we learn out one from two of them? From a combination of two of them, we should learn out to the third case. And the Gemara says, hey teisi, well, which one are we learning out from the other two? Lo nichtov rachmana b'kodshim. You could say the Torah shouldn't write anything by kodshim. V'teisei mehanach, and then you learn it out from Truma and Gerushin. But you can't do that. Malahanach shekein yeshna chol etzel kodshim, because those are unique again. They're considered mundane relative to the Karban Pesach, relative to kodshim. And lo nichtov rachmana b'gerushin. So then you'll suggest that the Torah shouldn't write it by gerushin, but teisei mehanach, and gerushin should be learned out. The concept of shlichus by gerushin should be learned out from the case of truma and the case of kodshim, Karban Pesach. But malahanach shekein yeshnon b'machshava. But again, what's unique in those cases is there is an idea of doing it mentally in those cases as well, in both of those cases rather, and you can't learn out gerushin from there. So rather, let the Torah not write anything by Truma v'teisei mehanach. We should learn out Shlichus by Truma from the combination of the case of by Gerushin and the case by Kodshim. And the Gemara says, Hachinami, indeed that is true. You could learn out Truma from the other two cases, and that brings us back to Gam Atem, V'ela Atem, Gam Atem, Lomali. But then if that's the case, why does it say Gam Atem? Why is there an extra word in that pasuk? We no longer need it from Shlichus, because again, Shlichus by Truma can be learned out from the other cases. And the Gemara says, "Mi boy lei l'chid Rabbi Yanai." We need that extra word, the gam. We need that for the teaching of Rabbi Yanai. The Yomer Rabbi Yanai, because Rabbi Yanai says gam atem. It says gam atem by truma ma'atem b'nei bris. Just like you are part of the covenant, af shluchachem b'nei bris. So too, when you appoint a shliach, you can't appoint a non-Jew to be a shliach in terms of taking off truma. That's learned from this pasuk. But the Gemara says, Halam alikra, but why do we even need a pasuk to teach us that the non-Jew can't be a shliach? We can learn that out anyhow from a different teaching, from the teaching of what Rabbi Chia bar Abba said, that Rabbi Yochanan said. The Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Chia bar Abba said that Rabbi Yochanan said, Ein ha'eved nasa shliach lekabel get miad bala shel isha. An eved is not able to become a shliach to receive a get from the husband of a woman. He cannot be a shliach lekabala to receive a get. Why? Because in general, an eved himself is not part of the laws of Gittin and Kiddushin. There is no concept of marriage. There's no concept of Gittin and Kiddushin by an eved. And if the eved is not part of those laws, he can't be a shliach for those laws as well. And so the same thing should be true by truma, because if the non-Jew is not part of the laws of truma, of course he can't be a shliach by truma. We would not need to learn that out from Gam Atem. But the Gemara says, no, Itzrich, we do need Gam Atem, you still do need the pasuk, because Sal Kadayt Chamina Eved Alav Bar Heteruhu Klal. I might think by an Eved, the Eved is not part of those laws at all. Aval Ovid Kochavim Hoel V'Isei B'Truma Denafshe, but an Ovid Kochavim, a non-Jew, he is relevant to Truma, to his own Truma, to Tanan, because we did learn in the Mishnah, Ha'Ovid Kochavim V'Hakusi. If you have an Ovid Kochavim or a Samaritan, Shatarmu, if they do take off Truma, Trumas on Truma, their Truma does have the status of Truma, so they are somewhat relevant in the laws of Truma, and therefore you might have thought they could be Shluchim, and that's why we have to have Gam Atem to teach you that they're not able to be Shluchim. Ein v'shliach nami ovid, I might think he can be a shliach as well. Kamash malon, that's what the pasuk Gam Atem is teaching, that he's not able to be a shliach. And Rashi explains, Sheken Yeshnon v'machshava, both when it comes to Truma and when it comes to Kachim, they are something that they can be done mentally. Kachim nami isnu b'machshava. Rashi says you can use machshava, thought alone works by Kachim also. For example, Gamar belibo lomar shor zeliola. Let's say a person thinks in his mind that this shore is a carbanola, harehu ola, that is considered to be a carbanola. Machshava works not only by Truma, it works by Kachim as well, and therefore again the Gemara said that's why you can't learn out from the cases of Kachim and Truma to Gerushin, because Gerushin is not something that can work b'machshava. And Rashi continues, Lefi she'eino v'chulu, an Eved is not able to be a shliach when it comes to Gittin and Kiddushin because he's not part of the laws of Gittin and Kiddushin. Alma lo boy cross, so you don't even need a pasuk when it comes to an Oved Kochavim not being a shliach by Truma. To misvori islam lamemer, it should be logical. To midi de lo shayich be lo mesavid lo shliach. There's a general rule: if you're not shayich to something, if it's not relevant to you, you can't be a shliach. They're also lav bar heteru garsinan. But then the Gemara said no. When it comes to an Eved, when it comes to Gerish, not relevant in any way. Eino b'shum tzad heter eshes ish. Eino megarish dain lo kiddushin. There's no kiddushin. There's no gerushin at all. Aval over kochavim hol v'yisei b'truma denavshe. But when it comes to a non-Jew, there is a concept of truma somewhat. Shetar mu'eshalhen, because if they do take off truma off their own property, trumas and truma, that is considered truma. Le'aser lazara, meaning it would have the status of truma, and a zara non-kohen would be prohibited to have it. To kasavar, and the reason is as follows: because this Tana holds ein kinyan lo kochavim Eretz Yisrael lahafkia, that the Oved Kochavim who has a kinyan who owns Eretz Yisrael, but that's not considered a kinyan to take away the obligation in terms of truma. Umeiruach Oved Kochavim eino poter min truma. The fact that the pile was finished by the Oved Kochavim, the fact that the Gemar Malacha was done, the finishing of the work was done by the Oved Kochavim, does not pater it from truma. Uvemenachos yalaf lataima mi degoncha trezimnei lemute digon Oved Kochavim vein miot achar miot el larabos. The Gemara there says you have a double exclusion, which is actually an inclusion, and that's why the non-Jew is included, and therefore I might have thought the non-Jew can be a shliach, and that's what the pasuk of Gam Atem is teaching, that the non-Jew cannot be a shliach. But the Gemara continues, Rabbi Shimon de Pater, but according to Rabbi Shimon, that when it comes to a non-Jew by Truma, he says that the non-Jew is Pater. This is talking about the obligation of paying a fifth, which we'll explain in a moment. T'tnan, as we learned in the Mishnah, Trumas Oved Kochavim, let's say you have a non-Jew takes off Truma, that Truma midamas, that does create, it creates a situation of a mixture. Let's say it falls into Chulin, it's going to prohibit that mixture. The Chayovin oleh chomesh, and also, you're chayiv, if somebody eats that Truma, you have to pay a chomesh, just like any truma, you have to pay a fifth. Rabbi Shimon poter, but Rabbi Shimon says, no, it's poter, the person is poter from paying the fifth. And Rashi explains, midamas im naflo lechulin osarta, meaning again, if the Oved Kochavim takes off truma and that truma falls in chulin, so that mixture is now aser, it's considered truma. V'chayovin oleh chomesh, and you have to pay the added fifth, ha'ochel b'shogeg. Let's say somebody eats that truma by mistake, there's a halacha, you have to pay a fifth when you're paying back. For Rabbi Shimon poter, but Rabbi Shimon says poter, meaning to say poter from that fifth, to kasavar, because Rabbi Shimon holds, ein meiruach Oved Kochavim chayavim b'truma. If the Oved Kochavim is the one that finishes off, that smoothes out the pile of grain, so that is not going to be chayiv in truma. There's no real chayiv truma. V'yolef lam midegoncha v'lo digon Oved Kochavim. He learns it from that exclusion we had above. It's your grain, not the Oved Kochavim's grain. B'menachos v'ledidei leka miyad achar miyot dematzrich lutzrichi. And according to him, it's not considered to be a double exclusion that includes. That's Rabbi Shimon's shita. So according to Rabbi Shimon, the Oved Kochavim is completely not relevant to truma. So it's obviously he can't be a shliach. And so the Gemara asks, Atem gam atem lamali. According to Rabbi Shimon, what do we need atem? What do we need the gam atem for? And Rashi says, Atem gam atem lamali pshita de lo have Oved Kochavim shliach. It's obvious the Oved Kochavim can't be a shliach. Though let's say b'truma denafshe, because he has no relevance to truma at all. Talking about his own halachas of truma, there is no reason to say that you need a pasuk to exclude him from being a shliach. And the Gemara says, no, Itzrich, it is necessary to have this pasuk, because I might have thought, Hoil v'yomar mar atem v'lo arisin, atem v'lo shutvim, atem v'lo apetropis, atem v'lo hatorim es she'eno shalo, because since the master said, when the pasuk says atem, it talks about you taking off truma, it's you and not sharecroppers, you and not partners, you and not apetropis, caretakers, you and not someone who takes off truma that doesn't belong to him. So these are all exclusions we learn out from atem. So eimo atem v'lo shluchachem nami, so I might have thought that atem and not your shliach, kamash malon, that's what it's teaching us. That's what the pasuk of gam atem teaches us. And what the Gemara essentially is saying is that according to Rabbi Shimon, even though by truma we said above that you can learn out the concept of shlichus in general from the other two cases, shlichus by truma can be learned out from shlichus by gerushin and shlichus by the case of kachim, by the case of Karban Pesach, and so therefore you don't need gam atem. That's what the Gemara had said. And then the Gemara said, so what do you need gam atem for? And the Gemara suggested that we need gam atem to say that a non-Jew is not able to be a shliach. But then the Gemara said, according to Rabbi Shimon, you don't need that because it's obvious a non-Jew cannot be a shliach because he's not relevant to truma at all. So again, within Rabbi Shimon, the question was, what do we need the gam atem for? And the Gemara is saying, well, you actually need it for what we said originally. Going back to what we said originally, the gam teaches us the concept of shlichus in general when it comes to truma. But don't we already know that? Didn't we already learn that out from the combination limud of gerushin and kachim? And the Gemara says not necessarily, because since the word atem, we say that atem excludes all kinds of individuals from truma, you might have thought that shluchim are also excluded. That's kamash malon. That's what gam atem is coming to include, the concept of shlichus by truma. And Rashi explains, itzrich l'rebuye shliach l'truma. We do need this pasuk to include the concept of shliach by truma, even though we just said above, again, that it should have been learned out from gerushin and kachim, but you still need it. Mishum dechsiv atem l'mu'ute arisim militrum chelko shel balabayis, because atem does come to exclude things. For example, it excludes a sharecropper. A sharecropper can't take off truma on the portion of the balabayis. The apotropos yisomim, and apotropos can't take off for the yisomim. He's taking care of the property of the orphans. If someone takes off truma on something that's not his property without the knowledge of the person, so in all of those cases are excluded. So I might have thought we should exclude a shliach. That's what we need the gam for, again within the shita of Rabbi Shimon. And the Gemara continues, Hanichol Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha. All of this is good according to Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha. And Rashi says, Hanichol Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha denafkale shlichus dekachim mivashachatu oso. He said, we said this above, he learns out the shlichus of kachim from the pasuk of v'shachatu oso. And that's what the Gemara quoted above. That's Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha said, Minayin sheshlucho shel adam kamoso shenemar v'shachtu oso kol kahal adas Yisrael, etc. That's where he learned out the concept of shlichus when it came to kachim. So that's all good according to Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha. Elul Rabbi Yonasan demapik leila haikra l'drasha achrina. But according to Rabbi Yonasan, who uses the same pasuk for a different drasha, so Manolan, so from where does he know the concept of shlichus by kachim? Titania, as we learned in a brayser, Rabbi Yonasan, Omer Rabbi Yonasan says, Minayin shekol Yisrael kulan yotzim. From where do we know that all of Klal Yisrael is yotze, can be yotze in terms of the mitzvah of Karban Pesach? We will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Mem Beis Amud Aleph.